Part 3. In this verse, the Upanishad discusses the concept of the higher self and the lower self residing within the heart. These two aspects are likened to light and shadow. The higher self is often associated with the soul or Atman, while the lower self represents the ego and worldly desires. The verse suggests that when one gains a deep understanding of the truth, they realize that all external manifestations are but reflections of the same underlying reality. This verse delves into the desire to comprehend Brahman, the supreme reality, in both its manifest and unmanifest forms. It points out that Brahman is perceived differently by those following the path of ritual and those on the path of wisdom. For the former, Brahman is the Lord of sacrifice, while for the latter, it is the eternal, formless, and universal Supreme Being. The other shore mentioned represents the realm of immortality and liberation from worldly fears. The Upanishad introduces a metaphorical framework to explain the various components of the human being. It compares the body to a chariot, the intellect to the driver, and the mind to the reins. The self is likened to the charioteer who guides the entire system. This verse continues the metaphor by describing the senses as horses and sense objects as roads. It emphasizes that when the self is united with the body, mind, and senses, it becomes the enjoyer of experiences. The key message is that the mind must control the senses to lead a balanced life. The verse highlights the consequences of an undisciplined mind and uncontrolled senses. Such a person is driven by desires and passions, akin to a charioteer being led astray by unruly horses. In contrast to the previous verse, this one focuses on the benefits of self-control and discrimination. When an individual exercises discernment and keeps the mind in check, their senses become manageable, akin to well-behaved horses. Here, the Upanishad underscores the importance of discrimination, self-control, and purity. A person who lacks these qualities will not reach the ultimate spiritual goal but instead remains entangled in the cycle of birth and death, samsara. Conversely, a person who possesses discrimination, a controlled mind, and purity can reach the spiritual goal, often described as liberation or moksha, where they are no longer subject to the cycle of rebirth. This verse extends the chariot metaphor to illustrate the importance of all faculties working harmoniously. Just as a charioteer must have knowledge of the road, control over the horses, and mastery of the reins, an individual must align their faculties to reach the highest spiritual destination. The Upanishad elaborates on the hierarchy of existence, beginning with the senses, which interact with sense objects. Beyond the senses is the mind, which processes sensory information. The intellect, discriminative faculty, governs the mind, and beyond that is the individual self, Atman. The unmanifest creative energy, avyaktam, lies beyond the individual self, and above all is the Supreme Self, Purusha. The verse emphasizes that there is nothing beyond the Supreme Self, representing the ultimate goal of spiritual realization. Building upon the hierarchy established in the previous verse, this one reiterates that there is nothing higher than the Supreme Self, Purusha, which leads to the attainment of the highest state. The verse highlights the subtlety of the self, which is hidden within all beings and not perceivable through ordinary senses. Only individuals with purified and focused understanding, often gained through meditation and spiritual practice, can discern the presence of the inner self. This verse provides a practical guideline for self-control and spiritual evolution. It suggests that one should control the senses with the mind, regulate the mind with the intellect, direct the intellect with the higher self, and surrender the higher self to the Supreme Self, Paramatman. The Upanishad implores individuals to awaken and seek the guidance of enlightened teachers. The path to spiritual realization is described as challenging and demanding one's utmost strength, vigilance, and perseverance. This verse delves into the nature of the supreme reality, Brahman. It describes Brahman as soundless, touchless, formless, eternal, tasteless, odorless, beginningless, endless, and immutable. Realizing this aspect of the self liberates individuals from the cycle of birth and death. Those who hear and retell the story of Nachiketas, narrated by Yama, the ruler of death, are esteemed in the world of spiritual knowledge. The Upanishad concludes by emphasizing the significance of reciting the highest secret of immortality before an assembly of pious individuals or during funeral ceremonies. Such an act is said to yield everlasting rewards. Part 4. The self-existent created the senses outgoing, for this reason man sees the external but not the inner Atman, self. Some wise men, however, desiring immortality, with eyes turned away from the external, sees the Atman within. In the last chapter, the ruler of death instructed Nachiketas regarding the nature and glory of the self. Now he shows the reason why the self is not seen by the majority. It is because man's mind is constantly drawn outward through the channels of his senses, and this prevents his seeing the inner self, Pratyagatman. But now and then a seeker, wiser than others, goes within and attains the vision of the undying self. Children, the ignorant, pursue external pleasures, thus, they fall into the widespread snare of death. But the wise, knowing the nature of immortality, do not seek the permanent among fleeting things. Those who are devoid of discrimination and fail to distinguish between real and unreal, the fleeting and the permanent, set their hearts on the changeable things of this world, hence they entangle themselves in the net of insatiable desire, which leads inevitably to disappointment and suffering. To such, death must seem a reality because they identify themselves with that which is born and which dies. But the wise, who see deeper into the nature of things, are no longer deluded by the charm of the phenomenal world and do not seek for permanent happiness among its passing enjoyments. That by which one knows form, taste, smell, sound, touch, and sense enjoyments, by that also one knows whatever remains to be known. This verily is that which thou hast asked to know. That by which a mortal perceives, both in dream and in waking, by knowing that great all-pervading Atman, the wise man grieves no more. In these verses, the teacher tries to make plain that all knowledge, as well as all sense perception, in every state of consciousness, sleeping, dreaming, or waking, is possible only because the self exists. There can be no knowledge or perception independent of the self. Wise men, aware of this, identify themselves with their higher self and thus transcend the realm of grief. He who knows this Atman, the honey-eater, perceiver and enjoyer of objects, ever near, as the Lord of the past and future, fears no more. This verily is that. He who sees him seated in the five elements, born of tapas, fire of Brahman, born before water, who, having entered the cave of the heart, abides therein, this verily is that. This verse indicates that he, the great self, is the cause of all created objects. According to the Vedas, his first manifestation was Brahma, the personal god or creator, born of the fire of wisdom. He existed before the evolution of the five elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, hence he was born before water. He is the self dwelling in the hearts of all creatures. He who knows a deity, who rises with prana, the life principle, existent in all the devas, who, having entered into the heart, abides there, and who was born from the elements, this verily is that. This verse is somewhat obscure and seems like an interpolated amplification of the preceding verse. The all-seeing fire which exists hidden in the two sticks, as the fetus is well guarded in the womb by the mother, that fire, is to be worshipped day after day by wakeful seekers, after wisdom, as well as by sacrificers. This verily is that. Fire is called all-seeing because its light makes everything visible. In Vedic sacrifices, the altar fire was always kindled by rubbing together two sticks of a special kind of wood called arani. Because fire was regarded as one of the most perfect symbols of divine wisdom, it was to be worshipped by all seekers after truth, whether they followed the path of meditation or the path of rituals. From whence the sun rises, and whither it goes at setting, upon that all the devas depend. No one goes beyond that. This verily is that. What is here, in the visible world, that is there, in the invisible, he who sees difference, between visible and invisible, goes from death to death. By mind alone this is to be realized. There is no difference whatever, between visible and invisible. He who sees difference here, between these, goes from death to death. In the sight of true wisdom, there is no difference between the creator and the created. Even physical science has come to recognize that cause and effect are but two aspects of one manifestation of energy. He who fails to see this, being engrossed in the visible only, goes from death to death, because he clings to external forms which are perishable. Only the essence which dwells within is unchangeable and imperishable. This knowledge of the oneness of visible and invisible can only be attained by the purified mind. The Purusha, self, of the size of a thumb, resides in the middle of the body as the Lord of the past and the future. He who knows him, fears no more. This verily is that. That Purusha, of the size of a thumb, is like a light without smoke, Lord of the past and the future. He is the same today and tomorrow. This verily is that. As rain water, falling on the mountain top, runs down over the rocks on all sides, similarly, he who sees difference between visible forms runs after them in various directions. O Gautama, Nachiketas, as pure water poured into pure water becomes one, so also is it with the self of an illumined knower, he becomes one with the Supreme.